Chapter 3. Reversal of the Overheated Medium. A headline for June 21, 1963, read, Washington-Moscow hotline to open in 60 days. The Times of London Service, Geneva. The agreement to establish a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow for emergencies was signed here yesterday by Charles Stell of the United States and Semyon Serapkin of the Soviet Union. The link, known as the hotline, will be opened within 60 days, according to U.S. officials. It will make use of leased commercial circuits, one cable and the other wireless, using teleprinter equipment. The decision to use the hot printed medium in place of the cool, participational, telephone medium is unfortunate in the extreme. No doubt the decision was prompted by the literary bias of the West for the printed form, on the ground that it is more impersonal than the telephone. The printed form has quite different implications in Moscow from what it has in Washington. So with the telephone. The Russians' love of this instrument, so congenial to their oral traditions, is owing to the rich non-visual involvement it affords. The Russian uses the telephone for the sort of effects we associate with the eager conversation of the lapel gripper whose face is 12 inches away. Both telephone and teleprinter as amplifications of the unconscious cultural bias of Moscow, on one hand, and of Washington, on the other, are invitations to monstrous misunderstandings. The Russian bugs rooms and spies by ear, finding this quite natural. He is outraged by our visual spying, however, finding this quite unnatural. The principle that during the stages of their development all things appear under forms opposite to those that they finally present is an ancient doctrine. Interest in the power of things to reverse themselves by evolution is evident in a great diversity of observations, sage and jocular. Alexander Pope wrote, Vice is a monster of such frightful mien, as to be hated needs but to be seen, but seen too oft, familiar with its face. We first endure, then pity, then embrace. A caterpillar gazing at the butterfly is supposed to have remarked, Wall, you'll never catch me in one of those darn things. At another level, we have seen in this century the changeover from the debunking of traditional myths and legends to their reverent study. As we begin to react in depth to the social life and problems of our global village, we become reactionaries. Involvement that goes with our instant technologies transforms the most socially conscious people into conservatives. When Sputnik had first gone into orbit, a schoolteacher asked her second graders to write some verse on the subject. One child wrote, The stars are so big. The earth is so small. Stay as you are. With man, his knowledge and the process of obtaining knowledge are of equal magnitude. Our ability to apprehend galaxies and subatomic structures, as well, is a movement of faculties that include and transcend them. The second grader who wrote the words above lives in a world much vaster than any which a scientist today has instruments to measure or concepts to describe. As W.B. Yeats wrote of this reversal, the visible world is no longer a reality and the unseen world is no longer a dream. Associated with this transformation of the real world into science fiction is the reversal now proceeding apace, by which the Western world is going Eastern, even as the East goes Western. Joyce encoded this reciprocal reverse in his cryptic phrase, The West shall shake the East awake, while ye have the night for morn. The title of his Finnegan's Wake is a set of multilevel puns on the reversal by which Western man enters his tribal, or Finn, cycle once more, following the track of the old Finn, but wide awake this time as we re-enter the tribal night. It is like our contemporary consciousness of the unconscious. The stepping up of speed from the mechanical to the instant electric form reverses explosion into implosion. In our present electric age, the imploding or contracting energies of our world now clash with the old expansionist and traditional patterns of organization. Until recently, our institutions and arrangements, social, political, and economic, had shared a one-way pattern. We still think of it as explosive or expansive, and though it no longer obtains, we still talk about the population explosion and the explosion in learning. In fact, it is not the increase of numbers in the world that creates our concern with population. Rather, it is the fact that everybody in the world has to live in the utmost proximity created by our electric involvement in one another's lives. In education, likewise, it is not the increase in numbers of those seeking to learn that creates the crisis. Our new concern with education follows upon the changeover to an interrelation in knowledge, where before the separate subjects of the curriculum had stood apart from each other. Departmental sovereignties have melted away as rapidly as national sovereignties under conditions of electric speed. Obsession with the older patterns of mechanical, one-way expansion from centers to margins is no longer relevant to our electric world. Electricity does not centralize, but decentralizes. It is like the difference between a railway system and an electric grid system. The one requires railheads and big urban centers. Electric power, equally available in the farmhouse and the executive suite, permits any place to be a center and does not require large aggregations. This reverse pattern appeared quite early in electrical labor-saving devices, whether a toaster, washing machine, or vacuum cleaner. Instead of saving work, these devices permit everybody to do his own work. What the 19th century had delegated to servants and housemaids, we now do for ourselves. This principle applies in toto in the electric age. In politics, it permits Castro to exist as an independent nucleus or center. It would permit Quebec to leave the Canadian Union in a way quite inconceivable under the regime of the railways. The railways require a uniform political and economic space. On the other hand, airplane and radio permit the utmost discontinuity and diversity in spatial organization. Today, the great principle of classical physics, economics, and political science, namely, that of the divisibility of each process, has reversed itself by sheer extension into the unified field theory, and automation in industry replaces the divisibility of process with the organic interlacing of all functions in the complex. The electric tape succeeds the assembly line. In the new electric age of information and program production, commodities themselves assume more and more the character of information, although this trend appears mainly in the increasing advertising budget. Significantly, it is those commodities that are most used in social communication, cigarettes, cosmetics, and soap, cosmetic removers, that bear much of the burden of the upkeep of the media in general. As electric information levels rise, almost any kind of material will serve any kind of need or function, forcing the intellectual more and more into the role of social command and into the service of production. It was Julian Bender's great betrayal that helped to clarify the new situation in which the intellectual suddenly holds the whip hand in society. Bender saw that the artists and intellectuals who had long been alienated from power, and who since Voltaire had been in opposition, had now been drafted for service in the highest echelons of decision-making. Their great betrayal was that they had surrendered their autonomy and had become the flunkies of power, as the atomic physicist at the present moment is the flunky of the warlords. Had Bender known his history, he would have been less angry and less surprised. For it has always been the role of the intelligentsia to act as liaison and mediators between old and new power groups. Most familiar of such groups is the case of the Greek slaves, who were for long the educators and confidential clerks of the Roman power. And it is precisely this servile role of the confidential clerk to the tycoon, commercial, military, or political, that the educator has continued to play in the Western world until the present moment. In England, the Angris were a group of such clerks who had suddenly emerged from the lower echelons by the educational escape hatch. As they emerged into the upper world of power, they found that the air was not at all fresh or bracing. But they lost their nerve even quicker than Bernard Shaw lost his. Like Shaw, they quickly settled down to whimsy and to the cultivation of entertainment values. In his study of history, Toynbee notes a great many reversals of form and dynamic, as when, in the middle of the 4th century AD, the Germans in the Roman service began abruptly to be proud of their tribal names and to retain them. Such a moment marked new confidence born of saturation with Roman values, and it was a moment marked by the complementary Roman swing toward primitive values. As Americans saturate with European values, especially since TV, they begin to insist upon American coach lamps, hitching posts, and colonial kitchenware as cultural objects. Just as the barbarians got to the top of the Roman social ladder, the Romans themselves were disposed to assume the dress and manners of tribesmen out of the same frivolous and snobbish spirit that attached the French court of Louis XVI to the world of shepherds and shepherdesses. It would have seemed a natural moment for the intellectuals to have taken over while the governing class was touring Disneyland, as it were. So it must have appeared to Marx and his followers. But they reckoned without understanding the dynamics of the new media of communication. Marx based his analysis most untimely on the machine, just as the telegraph and other implosive forms began to reverse the mechanical dynamic. The present chapter is concerned with showing that in any medium or structure there is what Kenneth Boulding calls a break boundary, at which the system suddenly changes into another or passes some point of no return in its dynamic processes. Several such break boundaries will be discussed later, including the one from stasis to motion and from the mechanical to the organic in the pictorial world. One effect of the static photo had been to suppress the conspicuous consumption of the rich, but the effect of the speed-up of the photo had been to provide fantasy riches for the poor of the entire globe. Today, the road beyond its break boundary turns cities into highways, and the highway proper takes on a continuous urban character. Another characteristic reversal after passing a road break boundary is that the country ceases to be the center of all work, and the city ceases to be the center of leisure. In fact, improved roads and transport have reversed the ancient pattern and made cities the centers of work and the country the place of leisure and recreation. Earlier, the increase of traffic that came with money and roads had ended the static tribal state, as Toynbee calls the nomadic food-gathering culture. Typical of the reversing that occurs at break boundaries is the paradox that nomadic mobile man, the hunter and food-gatherer, is socially static. On the other hand, sedentary, specialist man is dynamic, explosive, progressive. The new magnetic or world city will be static and iconic or inclusive. In the ancient world, the intuitive awareness of break boundaries as points of reversal and of no return was embodied in the Greek idea of hubris, which Toynbee presents in his study of history under the head of the nemesis of creativity and the reversal of roles. The Greek dramatists presented the idea of creativity as creating, also, its own kind of blindness, as in the case of Oedipus Rex, who solved the riddle of the Sphinx. It was as if the Greeks felt that the penalty for one breakthrough was a general sealing off of awareness to the total field. In a Chinese work, The Way and Its Power, a Waley translation, there is a series of instances of the overheated medium, the overextended man or culture, and the peripety or reversal that inevitably follows. He who stands on tiptoe does not stand firm. He who takes the longest strides does not walk the fastest. He who boasts of what he will do succeeds in nothing. He who is proud of his work achieves nothing that endures. One of the most common causes of breaks in any system is the cross-fertilization with another system, such as happened to print with the steam press or with radio and movies that yielded the talkies. Today, with microfilm and microcards, not to mention electric memories, the printed word assumes again much of the handicraft character of a manuscript. But printing from movable type was, itself, the major break boundary in the history of phonetic literacy, just as the phonetic alphabet had been the break boundary between tribal and individualist man. The endless reversals or break boundaries passed in the interplay of the structures of bureaucracy and enterprise include the point at which individuals began to be held responsible and accountable for their private actions. That was the moment of the collapse of tribal collective authority. Centuries later, when further explosion and expansion had exhausted the powers of private action, corporate enterprise invented the idea of public debt, making the individual privately accountable for group action. As the 19th century heated up the mechanical and dissociative procedures of technical fragmentation, the entire attention of men turned to the associative and the corporate. In the first great age of the substitution of machine for human toil, Carlyle and the Pre-Raphaelites promulgated the doctrine of work as a mystical social communion, and millionaires like Ruskin and Morris toiled like navvies for aesthetic reasons. Marx was an impressionable recipient of these doctrines. Most bizarre of all the reversals in the great Victorian age of mechanization and high moral tone is the counter-strategy of Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, whose nonsense has proved exceedingly durable. While the Lord Cardigans were taking their bloodbaths in the Valley of Death, Gilbert and Sullivan were announcing that the boundary break had been passed.